person who many of you know, because she is here, head of the department here at Queen Mary. So those of you who are students or colleagues, all know Professor Anat, who is professor of film, head of the Department of Film here at Queen Mary University. Again, has published too many books and what have you to list out. What I will say is that Professor Pick's area of research is primarily on animals, ecology, film philosophy, and feminism. Is that right? No. Feminism? Okay.
No.
Okay.
No.
Not so much. But I like Professor Stone, who just gave a very interesting talk. Professor Pick also has a forthcoming book with Edinburgh University Press. I'm starting to see a pattern here at Queen Mary. Everyone is with Edinburgh University Press. The title of the book is Simone Weil and the Cinema of Affliction. So we can look forward to that coming out next year. End of this year, 27. So the title of the talk today, a few thoughts on Simone Weil's Daoist Inclinations. So join me in welcoming Professor.
Thanks a lot. And I wanted to thank Kiki for the opportunity to participate. I'm not conversant in Eastern philosophies, and we've talked for some time about possible connections between the philosophy of Simone Weil and Daoism. So this is kind of like a first step in that direction, thinking about convergences and maybe some divergences as well. I hope I'm going to get through this okay. I've just come out of a bad flu and my voice is kind of croaky, so I apologize. Although she is discussed almost exclusively in the context of the Western tradition, the French philosopher, activist, teacher, and mystic Simone Weil was herself deeply engaged with Eastern philosophies. Last year's that book, Dharma and Detachment, published in 2025, edited by Nicholas Pomorito, compiled otherwise disparate references to Indo-Tibetan texts in Weil's body of work, especially her notebooks. We also know that around 1930, she taught herself Sanskrit and was profoundly influenced by the Bhagavad Gita. She wanted to read it in the original, on which she ended up writing towards the end of her life in her notebooks circa 1940. A renegade anti-clerical Christian, Weil's approach to religious traditions was profoundly syncretic. We'll talk about syncretism a little bit today. In a text called Letter to a Priest, that came out in 1942, a year before she died, she declares that different world religions all partake in the essential spiritual truth and are therefore worthy sources of inspiration. Rebecca Rosal Stone and Lucian Stone have written about Weil's theology. Note that, it's quite a humorous little quotation, they write, "The list of religious and ancient cultural tradition Weil admires is as long as it is diverse. Hinduism, the ancient Greeks and Egyptians, Daoism, Buddhism, European mythology and folklore, and, we mustn't forget, she even holds atheism in high regard." End quote. So Weil tended to collapse, I think, different traditions under a single universal truth. When she asserts that, quote, "the contemplation practiced in India, Greece, China, etc., is just as supernatural as that of the Christian mystics, and that Taoism too is very close to Christian mysticism," I think we're right to suspect that she judges not Christian religions in terms of what she sees as their proximity to Christianity. And as a side note, it's worth noting that the single religion that does not partake in this spiritual network of hers is Judaism, which she sort of vehemently opposed and criticized. I propose that Weil's position as a religious outsider, alienated from her Jewish heritage, yet never fully at home in Christianity, and her syncretic attitude to spirituality made her receptive to ideas from Eastern traditions spurned by the official church. References to Daoism in Weil's writing are few and far between. They do exist mainly in her notebooks, and they usually appear in relation to, often in relation to Stoicism. So there's some sort of nice references to pull out from her notebooks in relation to Daoism, but that's not what I'm going to do today. I'm actually going to focus on several of her key ideas that I think have that bear a deeper connection to Daoism and Daoist philosophy. Sort of broadly speaking, her brand of negative theology, well, you spoke about the apophatic, so she very much is a kind of negative theologian, the kind of via negativa of renunciation, detachment, what she calls decreation or unselfing. I'll talk about that. Her invocation of non-action, emptiness, self-effacement, and most importantly, today at least, Wei's concept of attention could, I think, fruitfully be read alongside Daoist ideas. Wei's religious philosophy underpins my own understanding of film aesthetics and ethics, so that's kind of why I'm invested in this project. And in what follows, I offer 2 points of contact and maybe 1 point of divergence between Weil and Daoism. I'm keeping things tentative by calling it her Daoist Inclinations, maybe in anticipation of a more kind of rigorous and detailed project to come. So the first point of contact, or the first inclination between Weil and Daoism is a single passage or a scene. I'm sorry about the wordiness of it, but it's a kind of scene, or almost like a sequence of a film, as I see it, from the book Gravity and Grace, which I suggest corresponds to the Chinese aesthetic concept of ideal. Am I pronouncing that right? Ideal. Okay. That Qi Yu discusses in her article on Daoism and film that was published in Screen in 2023. So I'm going to come back to that article several times. The second point of contact concerns the concept of attention and the Daoist notion that was also mentioned today, the Wu Wei, translated in different ways I learned today, but I'm approaching it as a kind of an acting without striving or effortless action. Finally, if time permits, I'll turn to one film example, and I'll talk very briefly about Anthea Kennedy and Ian Woodland's film Alarm Notes from 2025, which I just saw at Open City Docs, and sort of had an effect on me, and I thought it might fit in nicely with the kind of attentive cinematics that I'm trying to tease out. This comparative exercise is useful both in relation to the ecological dimensions of Wei's thought, which at long last are being addressed in the scholarship, and in terms of her critique of force, which is another sort of, I think, large frame of everything she does is really an attempt to kind of counter violence. And both of these obviously would require a much longer discussion. So recent work on the connections between cinema, Daoism, and Buddhism by Qi and by Victor Fan in particular has illustrated the contribution of non-European and non-Abrahamic philosophical and religious traditions to the understanding of the medium film. In cinematic ideal and cinema following Dao, Qi Yu discusses this idea of undoing the familiar Western subject-object dyad. And in that article, Qi explores cinema's, and I quote, cinema's potential to create what she calls a non-anthropomorphic subject-object fused ideal realm on screen. End quote. Sometimes translated as realm of meaning, the ideal realm is an aesthetics that eludes subjective human perspective, utilizes absence, and fuses feelings and scenery. Yu describes it as a work's creation of, quote, a subject-object fused spatio-temporal consciousness leading to an infinite imaginary realm beyond the totality of the image. Although ideal realm is a Chinese concept grounded in particular epistemological and intellectual and cosmological traditions, it can, I think, illuminate film more generally and eco-cinema more particularly. So, first inclination is, as I said, this scene from Gravity and Grace. Throughout her writing, Weil often refers to looking, perspective, and illumination, a language that lends itself to the discussion of cinema. A key concern for Weil, at once aesthetic, ethical, and ecological, is how to look without depleting or devouring the object of sight, the scene that we're looking at. Weil is concerned with perceiving the world in a manner that does not impose the onlooker's will and desire and leaves the scene intact. The central conundrum of Weil's realism, because in my book I read her in the context of traditions of cinematic realism, so the central conundrum is often formulated by her through the analogy between looking and eating, that calls on us to look without eating, without sort of swallowing, digesting, consuming, devouring the scene that we're looking at, or without sort of consuming and destroying the object of the gaze. Weil's analogy highlights the inherent tension between cinema as an extractive, devouring technology and its ability to refrain from consuming and conserve and perhaps even commune with the scene that it captures. And I've written loads about this under the kind of moniker of vegan cinema, so I won't go into that now, but it's certainly related to my previous work. Elsewhere, the problematic of looking is articulated by Weil through the need to abolish the subjective point of view. And this is this little passage. In a section entitled Self-Effacement, Weil writes, "May I disappear in order that those things that I see may become perfect in their beauty from the very fact that they are no longer things that I see." So you can see how the words themselves are kind of, they have to do all this kind of bending over backwards to try and achieve something that is impossible to achieve. I do not in the least wish that this created world should fade from my view, but that it should no longer be to me personally that it shows itself. And then it becomes a kind of principle or a sort of almost like a manifesto to see a landscape as it is when I am not there. And then she says, interestingly, as we've been talking about breath, when I'm in any place, I disturb the silence of heaven and earth by my breathing and the beating of my heart. So we can try and make sense of why she thinks breathing is counterproductive in this respect. At the center of this scene, and I can talk about this scene forever, but I'm trying to be concise. At the center of the scene is the paradox of an onlooker stubbornly present in her desire to not intrude. Moving from wishfulness, may I disappear, to a command to see the landscape as it is when I'm not there, the passage itself enacts a kind of impersonal vision. Weil wishes for a landscape from which the human protagonists have mysteriously vanished, and kind of reminded me of, for example, the ending of Antonioni's Le Fleece, but also, funnily enough, the ending of Showing Up, when you see Lizzie and Joe walking away, and the perspective is perhaps the perspective of the pigeon, but we don't really know. Reminiscent of Krakauer's camera reality and Bazin's non-living agent of mechanical capture, Weil devises, in this passage at least, she's I think trying to devise technologies of looking and being that simulate an impersonal gaze, not of God, but of the cinema, I would argue. Weil's worry that her beating heart might obscure the presence of heaven and earth reminds us that cinema registers human presence, or can register human presence, as equal to everything else. Thus, Weil's reverie of the vanishing human observer may be said to reveal a specifically cinematic sensibility. Kiki Yu makes a similar point when she writes that, quote, "From a Daoist perspective, the world is not a thing to be gazed at, given that the self, the thing doing the gazing, is always dwelling within the world. For Weil, end quote, for Weil, the imperial self, though illusory, is an imposing and distorting agent. To escape subjective imposition, cinema can construct impersonal, more than one perspectives, and different films do it in different ways." The passage's emotional charge derives from the way in which it handles the internal contradictions between the self, the world, the divine, all of whom are both present and absent. It reads a little bit like a Zen koan as well, a question about seeing and not seeing a landscape, or how can I see a landscape when I'm not there? Or what does a landscape look like when I'm seeing it if I'm not there to see it? As a text, the passage arguably functions as an ideorome, fusing emotion and scenery through the speaker's or onlooker's flickering presence. within this sort of scene that she's present in while simultaneously trying to vacate. It is, of course, also a meta text about making art. What attitude should the artist have in relation to what they're trying to create? In her book on Wei's literary vision, Catherine Bruick explains that, quote, it is self-emptying and not self-assertion that makes an artistic work great, end quote. Wei's cinematics mitigates not against tourism, for thinking in terms of film theory per se, I think, but against films whose center of gravity is the individual artist separate from their environment, and that kind of takes me back to Pietro's comment earlier about films being relational, a kind of set of relationships, and not just kind of emanating out of the genius brain of the artist. They're the culmination of intersubjective and interpersonal relationships. Weil calls the disappearing or undoing. For Weil, the artist, funnily enough, is actually like God, but not as an index of genius or power, but exactly the opposite. Because for Weil, God creates the world through self-emptying and retreat. So God, according to her, retreats from the world to allow its space to be. So this is very similar to other mystical traditions like Kabbalah, for example, where there's God has to make itself or themselves small in order to allow the world to be, and that's her analogy for artistic creativity as well. Weil calls this disappearing of the I, decreation, a form of unselfing that allows the world in life or art to be. And the key mechanism for this unselfing is what she calls attention, and that's the second point of contact, or the second sort of inclination, and that's attention. So in an essay about pedagogy, about education, Weil defines attention as the most important skill that students should acquire. Here again, she works through contradiction. Attention is both the greatest of all efforts and a negative effort. Attention is creation through personal renunciation. Attention is focused, but it's also slack. It pursues its objects by retreating from it. It's only by holding back and becoming receptive that film can pay attention. And here again, a host of aesthetic strategies and commitments on the part of films suggest themselves. One of Weil's most detailed accounts of paying attention links it to Daoist ideas about effortless action in a new way. For interest of time, I'll just highlighted these series of negative gestures that for her constitute paying attention. Suspending, detaching, emptying. And then there's this kind of landscape bit here, which also reminds me of the kind of landscape art that we've been discussing in the context of Daoism. So this again is here is an image that conjures an onlooker in a landscape, the contours of which will emerge in direct correlation to the onlooker's different forms of abstention. To this kind of looking, we might contrast films that practice forthright, muscular, or to put it uncouthly, penetrative aesthetics of contact. And I'm thinking, for example, of some of the sensory ethnography lab films like Casting Taylor and Werner Paravel's Leviathan from 2012, or Andrea Arnold's Cow. And these are films that their aesthetic and their sensibility is generated through the camera's material immersion in the scene of attention. An aesthetics of contact defined through enmeshment and immersion is most readily identified with the flat relational ontologies of new materialism. By contrast, I think, Weil's series of negative gestures, standing back, suspending, detaching, emptying, waiting, not seeking, is wary of entanglement as a mode of attention. And here is the potential, I think, divergence maybe between Daoism and Weil, where Weil still retains, I guess, the differentiation and separation between things, between entities, and is quite perhaps suspicious, at least as I read her, of the kind of ability of one thing to convert and transform into another without any differentiation. For the reasons that we started to talk about before around relations of power between different elements and the possibility of violence. And if you think of Leviathan and Cow, you'll see how these films are both entangled and enmeshed, and you can say definitely post-anthropocentric, and yet they enable and perhaps even capitalize on violence. Okay, so do I have time to briefly talk about the case study? 5 minutes. Okay. In that case, I'm going to show you a clip, but I don't have time to do it, so I'll just show you the trailer just to give you a little sense of the case study. So I saw alarm notes, as I said, in Open City Docs a few days ago. I haven't had time to digest it really, to think about it or research it, but it did. I don't know. I was kind of compelled to talk about it in this context because I think it does some interesting things. So very briefly, Alarm Notes is the story of Anthea Kennedy, one of the directors. Her grandfather, Ludwig Koch, a German Jewish pioneer of sound recording, who specialized in capturing the sound of birds and other wildlife. In 1933, following the Reichstag fire, Koch was detained by the Gestapo, later released, and then eventually fled Nazi Germany for Britain. The film is divided into 2 parts. The first, set mainly in Berlin and Leipzig, traces Koch's persecution by the Nazi regime. The second, filmed in the UK, focuses on his life as a refugee, his poor treatment by the BBC where he's trying to get work, and his work recording birds and other wildlife across the British Isles. And the film combines archival material like letters, objects, police records, with Koch's many recordings, sound recordings of animals and nature, and contemporary footage shot in Germany and the UK by the filmmakers. Accompanying the images and Koch's recording is a voiceover in the second person, seemingly addressing Koch himself, using the you. And the result, I think, is a complex layering of materials, spaces, species, and temporalities, part documentary, part memoir, part landscape film, and partly a study of political violence. I'll show you the trailer doesn't give you the full effect, but will give you a taste of it, at least. So we have
You, Ludwig Koch, live here. The third police find your name.
sorry, the clip's a bit off.
Now, listen.
So, in its composite elements, including a range of past and present audiovisual technologies, the film achieves an almost exemplary fusion of feeling and scenery, which is feature of the video. Although Yu tends to exclude voiceover narration from the cinematic inventory of Daoist or Daoist-inspired cinema, in this case, I think, the voiceover enhances rather than suppresses the proliferation of perspectives. Its affectless recitation of facts serves to inform the viewer, but the direct address is also disorienting. Addressing Koch as you, as if he were present, of course he's been dead for decades, only accentuates his absence. Nor is the voiceover part of the film's memorialism. It is too matter-of-fact and procedural. Occasionally, the second person address seems to speak directly to us, kind of interpolates us, generating the film's compound consciousness. The you creates openings in the narrative extending beyond the long-dead protagonist Ludwig Koch to the film's other living and non-living agents, linking vegetation, animals, objects, filmmakers, and audience, plus the recording technologies. The result is a more than human cinematic assemblage with a central human character, but a decentered human perspective delivered through archival remains. Just close with a couple more brief comments. Through its many close-ups of objects and architectural structures like the courthouse, the study, the police station, as well as its rural shots of rivers, trees, the sea, and the cliffs, Alarm Notes performs the second feature of the ideorealm, observing things through things. In the juxtaposition between sound and image, nature often appears as a witness. The result is an expansive realm of meaning, a product of impersonal, more than human practices of attention. Alarm Notes its avoidance of conventional historical reconstruction, piecing together past events via contemporary images of the relevant locations, allows the film's critique of violence to resonate in the present. And in this sense, and though they're very different kinds of films, Alarm Notes reminds me of Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest and of Christian Petzold's Transit, which Victor Fan writes about in his book as well, in this sense of kind of the crossing or mixing or looping of temporalities. Lastly, although this is a deeply personal project for the filmmakers, the film itself is an illustration of ethics of artistic retreat that make room for the artwork. Film scholar Rachel Moore described this as the filmmaker's, quote, humility before the work, crafting a space-time for human and non-human others, for the landscape itself to speak and be heard. Thanks.